In ancient Rome, running away wasn't just a personal act of defiance. It was seen as a challenge to the entire social order. When enslaved women tried to flee, the consequences were harsh and permanent. One of the most common punishments was being branded with hot iron. This wasn't symbolic. It was meant to hurt, shame, and leave a lasting mark. The brand was often burned into the forehead, making it impossible to hide. Letters like FVG, short for fugitivus, meaning fugitive, or longer phrases like TNOT fugitive, I hold you fugitive, were used. It turned women into walking warnings, visible proof of what happened to those who tried to escape. Being branded meant being permanently set apart, not just as someone enslaved, but as someone marked by failure and resistance. Even if they tried to blend in with free citizens, the scar told their story before they could. The procedure was usually public, sometimes accompanied by shouting or physical abuse. The emotional toll could last far longer than the physical pain. For women, the punishment struck even deeper. In Roman culture, female appearance was tightly controlled. A disfiguring mark on the face erased any claim to dignity, even within the enslaved class. Sometimes, they were forcibly held down during the branding. This wasn't an unusual punishment. It was routine. Roman laws didn't go easy on anyone, but enslaved women faced specific punishments meant to break both their bodies and spirits. In Rome, punishment wasn't just about control. It was about making an example. One especially degrading penalty for women who tried to escape was being chained at the front door of the home, a practice called adiannuum. This wasn't just about restraint. The front entrance of a Roman house wasn't just where people came and went. It symbolized a household's social standing. Chaining someone there turned her into part of the building, a message to everyone passing by. She was no longer just enslaved. She was a living warning. Often exposed to the elements in public view, these women were shackled with iron, usually to a column or wall near the entrance. The location ensured maximum visibility. The message was simple. This is what happens if you try to run. The humiliation was deeply gendered. Roman culture placed a high value on women's modesty. To be seen by the public in chains, or possibly with clothing removed, was a violation in itself. The goal wasn't just to punish. It was to strip away dignity. Some women were reportedly denied food or left chained for long stretches of time. Even Roman comedies and satires reference this, and archaeological findings of shackles in Roman homes support the reality behind the stories. Though sometimes treated lightly in literature, this practice was very real and very cruel. Among the most extreme punishments faced by enslaved women who tried to escape was being sent to the arena. While people often picture gladiators when they think of Roman games, these events also included public executions. Women who were considered difficult or repeat runaways could be condemned not to fight, but to die for entertainment. This often took the form of damnatio ad bestias, being sentenced to death by wild animals. This legal penalty was reserved for serious offenses, and for enslaved individuals, fleeing could qualify. Because enslaved people had no legal rights, their escape was seen as both a crime and a threat to public order. Women in this position weren't given a fair chance. They weren't trained to fight. They were placed in the arena unarmed, sometimes chained and exposed to lions, leopards, or bears. Some were burned alive or killed in theatrical reenactments of myths. Others were forced to fight each other with crude weapons purely for crowd amusement. These events were designed to humiliate. Female victims were often presented in ways meant to exaggerate their vulnerability and shame. The crowd, use of violence, took pleasure in their suffering. Some women were turned into characters in themed performances, blurring the line between punishment and stage drama. Ancient sources like Suetonius and Cassius Dio occasionally mention women in the arena, often focusing on those from elite backgrounds or female gladiators. But records, legal texts, and inscriptions confirm that enslaved women were also publicly executed there. For Roman audiences, these killings weren't just about punishment. They were about making a statement. The enslaved body was seen as belonging to the master and the state. So when a woman escaped, she wasn't just breaking the law. She was challenging that system. Her death, carried out in front of a crowd, was meant to erase her entirely while sending a clear warning to others. In Rome, whipping wasn't just common, It was expected. For enslaved women who tried to escape, it was one of the most brutal and frequent forms of punishment. The goal wasn't only to cause pain. It was to crush resistance and send a message. Whipping was carried out with a flagrum, a whip with multiple tails, sometimes embedded with metal or bone. There were no limits to how many lashes a person could receive. No courts were involved. The enslaver had full control. Punishment could happen in private or in front of others. In both cases, it was meant to shame. A woman might be left injured, her clothing torn, bleeding and on display, sometimes in public spaces like markets, so others would see what had happened. For women, punishment often included added humiliation. The aim was to strip away dignity and identity completely. Whipping wasn't the end, either. It often came before further punishment, branding, chaining, or forced labor. Roman writers like Horace, Juvenal, and Petronius mentioned these beatings casually, showing how accepted and widespread they were. Even in satire, the references reflected a system built on pain. Whipping, more than any other punishment, symbolized the absolute power one person could have over another. Of all the punishments Rome used against enslaved women who tried to flee, being sent to the mines was one of the deadliest. It wasn't just hard labor, it was slow death by design. Known as damnatio in Metallum, condemnation to the mines, this penalty was reserved for serious offenses. For enslaved people, that could mean escaping more than once. While men were sent more often, women weren't spared, especially their actions were seen as a challenge to authority. Mines in regions like Narcum, Dacia, and Sardinia were among the worst. The work was relentless. There was no fresh air, no safety, and no break from the physical strain. Tunnels could collapse. Toxic metals like mercury and lead poisoned the air. Women were forced to do the same exhausting tasks as men, digging, hauling, crushing ore, while facing additional abuse from guards. There was no protection and no return. Pregnancy didn't offer mercy. Some women gave birth in the mines. Many babies didn't survive. Unlike branding or public whippings, this punishment happened out of sight. These women disappeared underground. Their suffering was hidden, but no less real. In many cases, it was more complete. Branding, chaining, whipping, execution, the mines. The punishments used against enslaved women who tried to escape weren't random. They were designed to send a message. No one could defy the system without being broken by it. Rome used fear to maintain control. These acts weren't just cruel, they were strategic. They reinforced a social order built on pain and obedience. And yet, the need for such punishments reminds us that resistance did exist, that some still tried to run, to fight, to reclaim freedom, even when the cost was everything. Seneca once wrote, "They are slaves? No, they are human beings." A reminder that dignity doesn't disappear with status. It's denied but never erased. The stories of enslaved women in ancient Rome aren't just about cruelty. They're about control, resistance, and the human cost of empire. From being branded and whipped to facing public death or being buried alive in the mines, these punishments were never random. They were calculated acts meant to terrify, to silence, and to warn. Yet behind each brutal sentence was a person who had tried, against all odds, to escape. These women weren't just punished for breaking rules. They were punished for breaking expectations. In a society where obedience was forced and status defined by birth, an enslaved woman who ran was seen as a threat. Her attempt to flee wasn't treated as a mistake. It was treated as rebellion, and rebellion had to be crushed in public view. What's striking is how much effort Rome put into making punishment visible. Whether it was a mark on the face, chains at the front gate, or death in the arena, everything was meant to be seen. Pain became propaganda. The message was loud and clear. This is what happens when you step out of line. But despite it all, some still did. They ran. They resisted. They risked everything. And that's the part that often gets lost in history. The courage it took to even try. These women weren't passive victims. Their actions, however desperate, were choices made in pursuit of freedom. Today, their stories force us to confront the dark mechanics of power. How it's kept, how it's enforced, and who pays the price. And while Rome has fallen, the echoes of these systems, of punishment used to enforce hierarchy, still show up in the world we live in now. That's why remembering matters, not as a guilt exercise, but as a form of clarity. History is full of people whose names we'll never know, but whose lives shaped the systems around them. By telling their stories clearly and truthfully, we honor their humanity, and we learn from their struggle. If this history speaks to you, share your thoughts. Which punishment struck you the most? What lessons still apply today? Let's keep this conversation going, not just about ancient Rome, but about the enduring fight for dignity, freedom, and justice.